An unwanted and unholy union. The great hall of Nyansvet Castle was filled with doting servants, noblemen and women, and esteemed guests of King Caelan and Empress Shayla. The hall had been transformed into a spectacular display of artistry with exquisite colors woven into fine drapes and tapestries. Elegant rice paper partitions were scattered across the floor to give the semblance of privacy to attendees. Servants dashed hither and yon carrying pitchers of fine wine, and more potent fermented brews in leather kidney-shaped canteens. He Young, Huajong, and Hassoon balanced large platters of rotisserie pheasant, mutton, and roasted chicken on their heads as they shuttled back and forth to awaiting young maids at each table who served hearty helpings to the crowd. The rear of the great hall was reserved for the king's imperial guard. Dozens of the king's captains were seated in a large round table. Behind them, 200 of the greatest warriors sat at a long wooden bench that stretched the girth of the hall. In arm's length of each warrior was a massive chalice of red wine that Falson himself requested. The handmaids were under strict order to keep the chalice full. The warriors welcomed the chance to eat and drink like royalty. They wore no brooding countenances of military origins, and the wine ensured none would ever come. This was after all a celebration, they whispered to each other. As far as each was concerned, there was no need to remain stoic and worry over things that mattered not. In the massive hall and its hundreds of guests, the only sour face that day was found on King Caelan, who sat on his throne with Falson happily standing by his side. "I pray you do not mind, my lord," Falson began. "I thought every strong-hand and dedicated warrior should pay homage to you and to Princess Mieko on this day." "Is that why the most celebrated men in my army are present?" he said flatly. "Yes, my lord. They have a duty to bring word of my pledge to Mieko to all our warriors." Caelan rolled his eyes and turned away. He really didn't care what Falson said or did. Caelan did not want to hear Falson's voice ever again. Empress Shayla's bedchamber had also undergone a spectacular transformation. With the help of a bevy of handmaids and servants, her bedroom had been converted into a bridal chamber. Flowing white drapes of silk and fine linen were hung across the walls to cover the dismally flat monochromatic stone walls. Thick pelts were strewn across the cold stone floor, creating a plush lining of elegant warm fur. Servants and attendants hustled about carrying fine garments and an assortment of colors for eyeshadow and lipstick. Mieko stood, aloof and detached, in the center of all the commotion. There was an obvious scowl on her face, and she made no effort to hide it. To her, today was worse than any ceremonial performance she had to endure as the Princess of Nyansvet. She made no attempt to appear to feel otherwise. Contrary to her disposition, Mieko was stunningly beautiful in her imperial garment of red, green, and a hint of purple. She looked every bit the part of a princess, and Shayla took a moment to cherish the scene unfolding before her. Mieko wasn't just her daughter. She was Princess Mieko of the Nyansvet province. More importantly, Mieko was an instrumental part of her plan. As servants attached the last accessory to Mieko's imperial garment, Shayla carefully opened a satchel she'd retrieved from a hidden space beneath her bed. She removed a small tiara from inside the satchel. Mieko gasped at the exquisite beauty of the small crown. "It is magnificent, mother," she said. "It is yours," Shayla responded and placed it on Mieko's head. There were no words left to be said. With dour expressions, Mieko and Shayla wiped a tear from the other's face. Mieko wrapped her arm around her mother's arm, and Shayla escorted her out of the bedchamber. Grey clouds hovering above the black mountain had begun to spread east and west, and brought a soft mist of rain over the valley. Damori scurried through the forest, panting, eyes wide with anticipation. She wore no hood over her head, so her eyes danced in the little flickers of sunlight that pierced the scattering clouds. Small beads of perspiration formed on her cheeks, giving her brown skin deep incandescence when the light hit it just right. She stopped momentarily to don her hood and veil. Completely covered now, she marched through the last 50 yards of dense forest to the Jade Veld clearing. As she stepped out of the timberline, she saw Tanner arrive at the same time, directly opposite her. The coincidence made her smile, and she took a moment to catch and calm her breath. The two walked directly towards each other. Their eyes locked onto each other from the first step. As they moved closer, their eyes danced with each step and sway of their hips. One gravitated towards the other like a magnetic cosmic force. They stopped when they were within arm's length of each other. Damori's eyes fell upon the ground when she found Tanner's gaze too piercing to return. He took the hint and turned away, hoping that he hadn't appeared too creepy as he ogled Damori. They shuffled in place, swiveling their head left and right, avoiding eye contact. After a few moments of silence, Tanner turned back to the timberline to watch the woods. He tapped his foot impatiently. "It is unlike my father to be so late," he said, still surveying the woods. "I do not think he is coming, Damori." The sound of Tanner saying her name for the first time sent an odd tingle to her belly. Damori spat out a spontaneous giggle, and then covered her mouth. She mentally cursed herself for being so silly. Tanner folded his arms over his chest and studied her. Although he couldn't see her face, Damori carried herself in a way that Tanner could only identify as, Did I say something humorous? There was edgy defensiveness to Tanner's voice. "This is the first time my name has flowed from your lips. It sounds different." The way her voice trailed off at the end left Tanner feeling dizzy. He tried to shake it off, but felt himself moving even closer to her. He cocked his head and tried to find her eyes behind the veil. "Perhaps I should say your name more often, until familiarity warms us both." Damori shrugged and shied away. He quickly moved behind her and around until he was in front of her. She could have easily stepped aside, but she didn't want to do so. Instead, she looked up and let Tanner find her eyes, and she didn't turn away. "Is there something you wish to say, Damori?" Tanner's soft voice brushed across her ears like a fine silk kerchief. "Words are caught in my throat, my lord, but they beg for release." "I beg for the release of another kind, Damori." Tanner stepped closer. He was just inches away from her face. He could see the glint in her eyes reflecting the sun behind him. He reached for her veil. Damori gently pushed him back and drew her sword. "My lord, when we battle, there is no need for words." Tanner drew his sword. "Very well," he said. "Today you will cry for mercy, looking up at me with shock and awe in your eyes, as your back is pressed against the wet earth." Damori smiled. She liked that. She appreciated Tanner's confidence, and although she knew she could defeat him if at will, she took an on-guard position and waved him closer. The great hall of Unwanted Castle was filled with the sound of music and laughter. Noblemen, warriors, honorable guests from nearby villages and provinces were scattered about, while a small circle of privileged men surrounded Falson. They lifted glasses teeming with wine and toasts of congratulations. Falson pushed and bowed his way through the crowd, acknowledging their good wishes and secretly cursing their insufferable, entitled mannerisms. They disgusted him because they were foolishly unaware. As was expected, all the guests knew that at some point Falson would eventually be king. He was, after all, engaged to marry the princess who was the third in line to the throne. However, considering Kaelin's health, powerful reign, and unmatched skill, most, if not all, of the guests imagined he would remain king for a very long time. Then there was the matter of Shayla taking over after Kaelin passed away of natural causes. She was significantly younger than Kaelin, and it was not unreasonable that she would outlive him by 10 or 20 years. After Shayla passed away, the crown would be passed down to Queen Mieko. Falson, her husband, would naturally perform most of the required royal duties as king. As far as everyone in the Great Hall was concerned, Falson would not be king for a very long time. As Falson maneuvered through the crowd, he chuckled to himself. How foolishly aware they were. They had no idea Falson had seen this day years ago, and had set into motion a plan to expedite his rise. No, there wouldn't be decades or years of waiting. There was only a matter of a few hours left. Afterwards, he'd be the only person alive to claim the throne. Falson pushed his way through the last of the crowd. Mieko stood before him. Their eyes met for a moment, and she offered her future husband a dutiful smile. She bowed deeply, and hoped it was enough to show the required respect. But when she looked up, Falson was gone. He had walked past her without a second look and continued out through the east exit of the great hall. Mieko's shoulders slumped and sighed as she began her walk through the crowd and offered quick bowing acknowledgement to the curtsies and respectful bows of her guests. The constant and suffocating offers of congratulations began to annoy her, and she increased her pace and ploughed through the rest of the crowd. She marched past the throne where her father Kaelin sat, still brooding, and offered him the meanest, most glaring expression she could muster. For a second she thought Kaelin showed signs of regret, before his demeanor turned cold and disconnected again. Mieko dismissed the silly notion of her father's empathy and pushed through the massive wooden arched doors that led her away from the unwelcome celebration. She kept pace, walking firmly and with purpose through the castle corridors and winding stairs until she reached her mother's bedchamber. She took a moment to calm herself with a deep breath and smoothed her dress. As she was about to push open her mother's door, she realized tears were welling in her eyes. She wiped it away, and then, unexpectedly, she shuddered. Her airway narrowed, and she held her hand against the door to keep from falling. Her chest squeezed tighter, and she started wheezing until she felt faint. She felt her heart bouncing in her chest and thumping in her ears like an angry drum. She turned and leaned backwards against the door. It took a moment and deep concentration to subdue her oncoming anxiety, but Mieko was skilled in meditation and relaxation. It was one of the lessons Aelin guided her through as a young princess. Mieko placed her hands together, with only her fingertips touching. She closed her eyes and forced a slow, deep inhale. She exhaled even slower, and her wheezing stopped. She opened her eyes, and a tear rolled down her cheek, but she was no longer the victim of a sudden onslaught of panic. She heard movement on the other side of the door, and spun around just as Shayla opened the door. "Mieko," Shayla said, surprised to see her daughter. "Why are you here? You should be at Falsen's side." Mieko wiped the remaining tears from her eyes, stood tall, and composed herself further. "My future husband dashed off as if he were possessed," she said snidely. "He has no mind for his bride." Shayla pulled Mieko inside and hugged her. Mieko felt the sudden shudder and cramping of a mournful sob inside her chest, but she stifled the feeling and held tight to Mother. Shayla took Mieko by the hand and escorted her to the window. Shayla had spent the last hour staring outside, mesmerized by the dark clouds and the ominous patter of rain. She motions to the grand landscape in the distance. It is peaceful, yet it brings with it the chaos of change. There was an ominous, hollow tone in her voice. "Remember your promise to me," Shayla continued. "When the time comes, you must be strong. You must be the light that guides Damore. Your love and your royal entitlements must pull her from the precipice of despair." Within only a few hours, the steady rain in Nyansvet had spread wider across the region. As it crossed the Black Mountain threshold and expanded into Hangvuit, it transformed into a heavy downpour, particularly over a temporary bivouac just a few hours away from Hangvuit. Inside the encampment were thousands of raiders who lingered in tents and makeshift garrisons in preparation for war. Men sparred with heavy broadswords in the muddy bivouac as a battalion of thousands more fierce and savage warriors joined them on sweaty horses. Warriors greeted the reinforcements with weapons in hand, saluting and showing their readiness and eagerness for battle. Moon, the leader who'd been handpicked by Falsen, exited a large tent at the center of the camp. His captain whistled when he saw Moon, signaling the army, and a loud and caucus cheer erupted from the hordes of men. Moon thrust his sword in the air and they cheered even louder. Moon began to pace back and forth like a fighter pumping himself up before a big match. His breathing quickened and he hunched over with his massive neck and shoulders bulging like burlap sacks of dry rice. His face contorted into an angry countenance, and the crowd nodded to show its appreciation for a savage leader. "Men, warriors, fighters, savages, beasts, animals," he shouted. "Today we ravage this broken empire and show no mercy. For too long have they claimed the Black Wildwood as their own. For too long have they shut out the true believers. Today we end their reign and their lives." The men cheered even louder as Moon marched through the rain, parting the crowd of men as he raced to mount his horse. On this day we join our brothers who wait in secret beyond the walls of Hangvuit and Nyansvet. Death to Hangvuit! Death to Nyansvet! He shouted as his horse reared up. The men roared again and thrust their swords in the air, anxious to taste the blood of battle. Rain cascaded in a fine mist as Damory and Tanner battled in an elegant demonstration of swordsmanship that more closely resembled a dance-like mating ritual than an epic bout. The two young adults took every opportunity to slam their bodies together, intertwine their legs, and grapple with their chests closer and closer. Over the course of their epic duel, time stood still. Fatigue had no place on their intimate battlefield. The sun peeked out and withdrew from clouds many times as the rain changed from drizzle to teeming downfall. After endless hours, their clothing was soaking wet and clung to their bodies like wet rags. Still, their kicks and swords flew. Tanner ultimately succumbed to muscle fatigue first, and lost any chance he had of defeating Damory. Not that he ever wanted to. It would have been more accurate to assume that he wanted to grapple with her for a lifetime. However, his muscles failed to do what his mind told them, and he left himself open. Damory pelted him with the empty sheath, and swept him off his feet, literally, with her right leg. Tanner was airborne for a moment before he fell into a jet-black mud puddle. Damory positioned herself above him, gloated. "My lord, it looks like you are the one with his back pressed against the wet earth." Tanner knew he'd been defeated. What other outcome could he hope for? Intellectually, he'd reasoned months ago that the skills Damory had been blessed by the natural forces of the earth would always surpass his. Regardless of how much he trained, she was gifted. He appreciated that about her. In fact, he reasoned with himself as he looked at Damory standing above him, smiling with her hand offered in consolation. He more than appreciated her supernatural gifts. He loved them as much as he loved her. Still, he wouldn't let her celebrate too easily. Tanner scooped up a handful of mud and whipped it at Damory. She shrieked and cowered back. It was a vocalization he'd never heard in all their bouts. He took it as shock, stunned surprise as she cowered. He scooped another handful of mud and slung it at her. She retreated without resistance, without putting up a fight. Now he thought her response was extremely odd, and it gave him pause. He wondered if he'd hurt her or gotten mud in her eyes. Damory looked up at Tanner, holding her hands in a defeated gesture. In her expression, he saw why she offered no resistance, and why she cowered in abject fear. Damory was terrified. Damory gawked at her dirt-stained, muddy clothing. Her hands trembled as she was overcome with panic and anxiety and feebly tried to wipe away the dirt only to make it worse. "What have you done?" she screamed. Her voice was shrill and shaky. "I cannot return home looking like this." Tanner gawked at her, incredulous. He couldn't believe the words coming out of her mouth and the fear in her voice. Was this a trick? "Damory, you pummel me, and then you worry over my muddy garment?" he questioned. "How can that be?" "Spare me your deception." She was still screaming, and her pitch compelled Tanner to step back. "Your deception is obvious," she accused him. "You soiled my clothes to force me to reveal myself." Tanner was offended, but he also felt guilty. Had he given Damory the impression that he would stoop to such lowly behavior to coerce her to reveal herself to him? Instinct took over, and he moved closer to Damory even though she waved him away. He took a deep breath, caught her gaze and held it. "I know that such an action would place you in grave jeopardy upon your return home. Know this. Whatever your circumstances are at home, I would give my life before I brought harm to you." Damory stared into his eyes, and in an instant she was convinced he meant it. Her panic faded, but the fear lingered. She was still faced with a tough predicament and no resolution. "I am afraid I may no longer have a home." Tanner removed his robe and offered it to Damory. "Nonsense. Wear this and return with me to Hangvuit. You will have privacy in my royal chambers while my servants clean your garments. You can return home in the morning when they are dry." Damory was pleasantly surprised, and she felt herself move closer to Tanner. She was sure, though, that she hadn't planned to take steps in his direction. There was some force inside her that compelled her to seek him. "You would take me to your kingdom," she mumbled, "and allow me to enter your royal chambers?" Without a moment of hesitation, he responded quickly, almost before she'd completed her sentence. "Come," he beckoned. "The rain will delay our journey, so we must get started now." His words sounded genuine and true. Still, it was unfamiliar territory for Damery. She studied him curiously, and she found no reason to stifle her doubt about his motives. After all, Tannar was a clever wordsmith. She looked him deeply in the eyes and said, "My lord, I'm neither worthy of your hospitality, nor deserving of your trickery and apathy." Tannar took Damory's gloved hand and coaxed her forward with a gentle tug and a reassuring smile. "I offer no deception, Damory," he said. "I only offer concern. I swear upon my mother's name, there is no trickery in me." Tannar was indeed a clever wordsmith. His words softened Damory like butter, and she yielded. She willingly followed him into the woods.